So, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and good night to all those who are listening to this podcast right now. This is an episode that came out of just a common discussion between myself and the team in SecurityLah. We don't just talk about the show and the episodes we do. We also actively discuss about security issues, concepts, what kind of problems we face, and we share insights and we share inputs. And this topic came about because we had such an interesting and engaging discussion, and we thought we should share the points across to all of our listeners, and hopefully you actually benefit from these discussions that we had. So today's topic is on risk and vulnerability management. So I'm going to set a quick context to how this discussion came about.
Welcome to the SecurityLah podcast.
We were talking about vulnerabilities and how organization manages vulnerability. So to set the context a bit more clearer, we were referring to, just say for example, if you have a bug in a particular operating system. Now, that's not going to be the only bug that may be announced for this week or last month. You may have 10, 20. Vendors like Microsoft have Patch Tuesdays where they may announce a whole slew of vulnerabilities where it needs to be patched, and they issue the patch as well. Now, in some organizations, they may take the approach where, okay, Microsoft has issued a patch. Let me just go in and click install. And they get their system patched, and lo and behold, fingers crossed, everything works, all fine and well. But we've also seen that failing very, very badly. So there are vendors, which we will not name out of respect, that have issued patches for patches, which means that while that patch solves that particular bug, it either undoes a previous vulnerability or it creates another issue. So without proper testing in your environment, just patching alone will not work. So organizations take through a lot of trouble. More mature organizations, more thorough organizations, take a more thorough approach, more detailed approach, whereby they put these kind of patches into testing and then into production. And when there is a lag of these kind of environments, guess what happens? You're going to start accumulating more and more patch. And then if you look at severity, some has high severity, some has medium severity, and some may even have low severity. So we were talking about how do you prioritize or how do you manage these things in an environment? And I'm going to hand it over to Nigel to start his series of questions, and I'll do my best to try to answer him.
Yes, so one of the questions that I did raise was about, when you have multiple vulnerabilities, and depending on the severity, you would put it into your risk matrix. If it's high or critical, you would decide to patch it. If it's low, you may, decide to put it in the back seat for a while. Maybe you don't have the right resources, or maybe you just believe it's not important, right? But what happens when you chain vulnerabilities? Now, there are certain attacks which are called vulnerability chaining. You can take two low severity vulnerabilities, for instance, chain them together, and then these two low severity vulnerabilities tend to become a high risk vulnerability. Now, if you have two low risk vulnerabilities that are not patched and then they're chained together to make or to kind of create something that is high risk, then in situations like this, how does one go about, identifying this? If you don't understand this, I mean, how if we can't really figure this out, how do we go about patching it from there?
Okay. Now, to answer that question, then I go back to a fundamental issue. How do we decide what to patch? Of course, the default answer you get from anyone is that, yeah, look at the patch severity and then you decide, what you want to patch. But the way that I look at it, and this is my view and how I've practiced it, is that we don't just look at the vulnerability, but we also look at the system that is being affected. So, which means that number one, you must have an asset inventory that covers all of your systems in production. Now, that's a must. And it shouldn't just be, oh, I have server A. You should have detailed information as to you have this server at this patch level that has all these things deployed. It's running this particular application. And the important thing that I like to stress is criticality. How critical is that system to your environment? Now, that said, you may have a low critical system which is connected to a high critical system. Now, because of this interconnectivity, then guess what happens? That low critical system can and will definitely affect the high critical system. So, which means that you can't just say it's low. Because of that interconnectivity and that relationship, you now have to start looking at, I can't just look at high, let me look at the ecosystem as a whole. So you start mapping the relationship between systems and you find that, okay, I have to look at it in a slightly macro view rather than just a micro view. Because just looking at the criticality alone, you may miss out certain intersections which may be the next point of vulnerability to get into your core or your critical systems. All right, it's like you have a medieval castle and you have where your crown jewels are stored, but guess what happens? A drone can fly through the window and take your jewels away. So not really secure if you have those old castles and you have modern day drones that's going to just fly in and if you have modern day drones that's just going to fly in and pick stuff up. So now back to Nigel's question. When you look at chaining vulnerabilities, you have two vulnerabilities that are low that can be chained to create a super vulnerability or a higher vulnerability. Now, this implies that you actually have someone within your organization to do that research and say, this can be chained together in order for you to get this. So I'll quote an example of zero logon. Zero logon requires a low privilege user with the right vulnerabilities, with the right bugs or exploit to exploit the Active Directory, gain access into a privileged account, and from there launch an attack either against the Active Directory or against all other clients that are connected to the directory services. So in that instance, you have multiple vulnerabilities that are chained. Now, which can be chained to what? You need to have some sort of R&D. There's no way for you to say that this will work. It requires understanding of the system, and it also requires understanding of your operating environment. So if you're chaining vulnerability against a low criticality system that has no interconnectivity to anywhere else, well, if you ask me, yes, I wouldn't be so worried about that. But if the same attack goes to a low criticality system that's connected to a high criticality system, then I would be really fearful, because at the end of the day, that gives the person backdoor access into that system. But Nigel, is that all that you wanted to know, or was there something else that you're asking? We also looked at, is it something that everyone should be concerned about chain vulnerability? Yes, you should be concerned about it. It's something that will affect you, that can affect you. It's not something that anyone is going to publish and say, yeah, I chained these 3 exploits and I managed to get this. There are a lot of this chaining that is not publicly released. So in order for someone to actually say that these vulnerabilities can be chained, causing this ripple effect, you really have to have a team that does this. Probably a red team that may specialize in exploit development which is a highly specialized skill. It's not something that any red team could do. If you have a very senior red team personnel who can build their own exploits or can reverse engineer a patch and say, okay, based on this patch, this is the exploit that works for an unpatched system, then yes, then that person would most likely be able to do some of this chaining to gain access into your system. But beyond that, it's not something that anyone could do. And the reason why, if you ask me, would I focus more on chaining or would I focus more on criticality? My view is I would focus more on criticality. And the reason being is because I want to prioritize the systems that's really important to me, because patching is not easy. And a lot of organizations spend a lot of time doing patching. You have to test, make sure the patch works. And you have to make sure once you've done your regression test, you've loaded your applications, everything is good. Then you have to schedule a time where you have all your other application owners or your dependencies to be there to make sure that if you bring down that particular server or services, when you bring it up, all the other periphery system actually works. So it's not just about, okay, I just put a patch in the system and I forget about it. No, you need to make sure that it works. And it doesn't stop there. Some patches affect performance. Maybe your CPU suddenly shoots up to 100%, or your memory utilization goes up, or suddenly the process becomes hung or non-responsive. There's so many possible scenarios that this can happen. So testing takes a long time. Deploying patches take a longer time. Stabilization also takes time. And this is to cover a whole maturity period. And when I say we look at criticality more than chaining, my concern would be is that I want to protect the servers that are critical. That means I'm going to prioritize. If I can do 5 servers, for a lack of better example, if I can do 5 servers every weekend based on my corporate policy, then I'm going to prioritize the servers that are more critical to go and get the patch first, make sure it's stabilized, do thorough testing, get it up and running, as compared to other servers or services that may not be that critical, but may still be vulnerable. We are all stricken by 24 hours a day. No one has unlimited resources for them to do this the whole week. Business needs to run, services cannot go down. So you have to schedule it when it's convenient for the system owners or the business owners to say, yeah, I don't mind 2 hours downtime this week, but don't touch the system until next month because we have this promotion going on. So there's a lot of business plurality that happens whereby you can't just bring the system down. There's a reason why the system is there. It's there because of business. So there has to be that fine line that you have between making sure that the system is secure and the system is running. Because if the system is not running and it's down and business can't do business, essentially that's also denial of service, if you look at it from a different perspective, right? And for someone to actually be able to execute chain vulnerability, we assume that the hacker is already inside your organization, is studying your organization, is looking at what servers you have, and based on that, he starts launching an attack.
Enjoying the show so far? Subscribe now so that you don't miss out on the latest episode. We are available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and many other platforms. Visit podcast.securitylah.asia to get the links to subscribe.
Assuming if your organization is well oiled, meaning that you patch, you keep to a certain discipline, and you make sure your systems are all good and well, then it's going to be less likely for an attacker, even if he gets access into your organization because he did a phishing attack and someone clicked on the link, it's still going to be difficult for them to get through into your critical systems or servers, which means that the person needs to try. And just say, for example, if he discovers a local vulnerability, because you're running a process in a user land, you're not using root access on a Linux box, then the attacker now has to figure out how do I do a local privilege escalation? How do I raise my level of privilege from being a normal user into a super user, and from there getting access into a different system of going there? So it's more time consuming, which is why I would focus more on criticality and prioritization, because if the attacker is already in your system, I believe you really have a bigger problem than chain vulnerabilities. Yes, chain vulnerabilities is something you must consider. I'm not saying don't, but in my view, or in my limited view, I believe that if you do criticality and prioritization, which means if you do effective risk management, then issues like vulnerabilities and chain vulnerabilities is something that you could minimize. You probably may not be able to eradicate it completely because of the business requirements that is imposed on you, but you could minimize it to a point where, yeah, we've reduced the exposure to only these 5 systems or 6 systems. So this is the only thing that's going to affect you, and you can swoop in and do your incident response and digital forensics and manage and mitigate the situation. That's my take on this.
So just another scenario. Again, I do agree with you that asset criticality is important, and we need to consider the criticality of the asset, where it is placed, do a risk analysis and everything. But let's say again, this is a different scenario. You have a machine or a system which, let's take it, any application, right, a web application that uploads the file, and this file gets stored on a cloud system or a cloud storage, let's say S3 bucket, for instance, on AWS. And there is a misconfiguration here, which allows someone to access this file over the internet, which means there's no proper authentication or authorization set over there. In situations like this, even though the system or the application may not be critical, you still have a huge problem here, which is just allowing someone to upload a file without proper validation and accessing it. The way I look at it, it could be a storage for ransomware or some storage for malware, right? What do you think? Something like this, when it comes to managing risk, how does one go about with it?
The first thing is you need to understand the interconnectivity of your system. So if a system talks to another system, then someone should actually have an idea of which system is it connecting to, why is it connecting to. There has to be some level of access control that's being done so that you prevent these kind of scenarios. So for example, if you have a web server that has a backend system, then the last thing you'd want to do is open it up to internet. In fact, one of the biggest issues I've seen with server environments is that you have browsing enabled in the servers, which to me is a huge no-no. All right. These kind of things are what creates the potential for data to actually go out. I've seen core systems or backend systems that even have USB port enabled, right? One could argue and say, yeah, we want to do out of band patching, so we need USB, but that's not something that you do on a daily basis. You probably do it in exception, and that's something that should be enabled and disabled by policies to make sure that you don't access out. So the challenge comes when you have systems that genuinely talks to cloud servers, right? For whatever reason. Then how do we control data that goes out? So we do have, for example, cloud access security brokers where you manage, for example, connectivity that is in the cloud. So there's security on your system. There's also security on the cloud. So in your specific example, you use the cloud and an open S3 bucket. Then you have to set your policies in your S3 buckets to make sure that you don't allow any open buckets out to the internet. If there is, then if someone accidentally misconfigures a storage bucket, then then the security admin gets a notification and says, there is a open bucket. Do you want to allow it? Or by default in your organization policies, it says there's no such thing as a open S3 bucket. Data that transfers between server and out to the internet should be something that is policed, either via proxy or whatever reason. So then you can have policies within these kind of systems to prevent upload into an internet cloud or internet services. We've seen recently that OneDrive, Microsoft OneDrive, was used to host malware. And if you have organizations that use Microsoft Teams or Microsoft-based solutions, you're going to have a huge problem because you now have this malware on OneDrive. My question would be is that in what instance would you want to access an unknown OneDrive? And does your organization allow arbitrary access of OneDrive? If your organization allows arbitrary access of OneDrive, you have a bigger problem. I'm not saying don't use OneDrive. I'm saying that you should be able to police and govern these kind of cloud usage. Because, I mean, we go into this argument of shadow IT, users who create their own infrastructure instance and use it because the existing IT processes are either too cumbersome or too restrictive for them to be able to do their job. So someone uses their credit card, buys a couple of servers on DigitalOcean or Amazon or wherever they want to buy and spin up their own projects and do stuff. And without organizations knowing it, you really have data outside. So the problem of what you described goes beyond just vulnerabilities, but actually IT management and how you enforce this. That's a huge topic on its own, Nigel. And I think one day we should really look into cloud security and have a good discussion around that. That's a great topic to talk about.
Yeah, I had a question earlier on, and well, I wanted to know to what extent vulnerabilities will actually become an exploited risk. The reason why I asked this is if we look at the topic vulnerability and risk management, first thing, risk is the likelihood, the probability that we surpass a determined level of consequence at a certain time. And we cannot be vulnerable if we are not threatened. And you cannot be threatened if you're not vulnerable. So these two conditions, they are actually mutually conditioning one another for risk reduction. Okay, so what I had, the impression that I had all this while is that there is a lack of risk approach that is holistic and consistent to guide decisions. Because from what you have shared, it's obvious risk touches on so many factors. And a lot of times, if there is a lack of awareness and responsibility on the part of various parties or decision makers, then risk reduction will not be achieved. And vulnerability and risk management remains a manual, a guide. If A, then B. If C, then D. I think that's in essence the issues that I have with the whole topic.
The first part is about whether a vulnerability can become an exploited risk. Now, in some instances, it is already defined that this particular vulnerability can be exploited. So, for example, they may say, oh, this vulnerability may result in remote code execution, or this vulnerability may result in local privilege escalation. So you already know what that vulnerability can result. But it doesn't stop there. Just because a vulnerability isn't defined in that manner doesn't mean it can't be exploited. It can be exploited if you develop it further. So you may have exploit developers who actually look at these exploits and say, okay, let me take a stab at it And I may actually get this to be from just a vulnerability in a drawing software into a full system compromise. So it may be a chain vulnerability, or it may just be an exploit, because, for example, the GDI or the GDI plus framework is used by a lot of systems, and it's also run at a very high privilege depending on what application is being used. So if I can trigger vulnerability in that library, depending on what context, then I can even get kernel level access, for example. So can it be an exploited risk? Yes, it can. So that's just to answer one of the parts of your question.
Okay, so that means, because my argument is that you have to be threatened for a vulnerability to exist, and vice versa. If you're not vulnerable, you cannot be threatened. So a very academic question that I have here is that who says that's a vulnerability? And given all the guides that we have, to what extent do we have any record in the industry or anywhere where this such vulnerability actually becomes an exploited risk?
A data breach would confirm that. So if someone breaches, then yes. Or the other way is you have security researchers publishing POCs, proof of concepts. So you can actually get these proof of concepts of code, run it against your system in a lab that confirms that, yes, I've managed to exploit the system. So there are two ways to actually know that. You can use the POC, do it in a safe environment. Please do not do it in a production environment. You may risk bringing down the system because some of it may create denial of service, which means the server may reboot, or it may just hang, or may create an unpredicted outcome. So you can test this and say, yeah, this works. So the POCs are there for a reason. You can actually try that. You have security tools that actually does this kind of testing. They may incorporate the latest CV vulnerabilities. So if you have that subscription to those kind of tools, that can also help you to confirm if your systems are susceptible. So these are two ways that I can find the easiest for you to test on a test system for you to validate.
Okay, thank you.
I guess that wraps up the discussion about risk and vulnerability management. It's not definitive as to where we are with this, because there's a lot of question about how vulnerabilities affect people, and today systems are going beyond just traditional servers and devices, but it's also going to IoT devices. Some of these vulnerabilities may even affect embedded devices. And what I mean by embedded devices are like intelligent pacemakers, blood glucose monitors, spews into a medical device, which may have tangible and probably very deadly effect on people. So while we may say that, yeah, these are just systems, worst comes to worst, I just reboot the system or restore the system, vulnerabilities may eventually affect livelihood. So we hope to give you some clarity on the matter, and thank you for listening in.
Thanks for joining us this week on SecurityLah. Make sure to visit our website at securitylah.asia, where you can subscribe to the show in iTunes, Spotify, or via RSS, so you'll never miss a show.